Hi, I'm Scientific Illustrator Stephanie Rozzo. Welcome to Nature Sketch Group's Blue-Eyed Grass Go Out and Sketch instructional video. In this video, I'll be showing you how to apply what you learned with your step-by-step lesson. You can follow along with this lesson even if you don't have the step-by-step kit. Help this tiny business by clicking that like button, subscribing to this YouTube channel, and shopping for lesson crates at naturesketchcrate.com. Make sure you have all the materials you need before you go out to sketch. So blue-eyed grass is not actually a grass. It is an iris, as you would have learned with your Hello Blue-eyed Grass, a little about me insert in your lesson packet. For the Go Out and Sketch a Blue-eyed Grass lesson, you're instructed to go out and sketch a blue-eyed grass or something similar. So you can definitely sketch any iris. And that would be a great way to apply the step-by-step lesson. So today I'm sketching an African iris or evergreen iris, and this way you can see how you can apply this to something that looks a little bit different using all the same paints and materials. Unlike the blue-eyed grass, this flower blooms year-long, and so it's easier to get clipping like this any time of the year. Remember, this is just a sketch. Take your time, relax, enjoy observing nature, and don't get too caught up with accuracy. Let's get started. So once you decide what you want to paint, and I'm going to paint this African iris, you want to decide what parts you want to paint. And there's a lot going on here. So to make this really simple, I'm going to focus just on this flower and this stem here coming off and this little emerging bud here. And to make it really easy, I'm going to go ahead and just trim this off right here. And put all that other stuff to the side. Now, if you're not working from a clipping, and hopefully you are outside doing this, you can just put your paper behind the flower without even removing it from the plant. And then I think it's easiest just to trace right over it if it fits on your paper. And you can do that right from the plant outside. I'm going to show you how to do that right now here. But first, you want to figure out how you want it arranged on the paper. So I want to be able to see this part of the flower. So I might actually hold it up a little bit and then draw it, because I want to draw it from that view. And your view might be just a little bit different from the camera overhead view there. So make sure you arrange it on the page how you want it to figure out the composition. And of course you can add some of these other things on the side if you end up wanting to add them. You can just simply add it in the white spaces too. You can continue to draw. But for simplicity, I'm going to keep just this flower and this one little stem here. So now that I have it at an angle that I like, I'm just going to hold it down gently, and I'm just going to do a really light sketch outlining the plant. It doesn't have to be exact. Just get the basic size and shape on there, and you'll need to remember this will be just a little bit bigger than the plant because you're sketching and drawing light lines around the outside. It helps to keep your head in one place when you're doing this so that your view doesn't change. And if you want to make marks, say I want to know that this is coming down here, that's where this originates, this spot here. And then again, the same way, you can draw a line going down, spot originates there, and then here, there's another line here, and the spot originates about there into the center of this flower. I'm going to draw around the green areas to outline them. It's hard to keep it exactly in the right spot, so don't worry too much, again, about everything being super accurate. It's just a quick study of this plant. Once you have that done, I want to try to keep the plant in the similar spot so that I know it stays in the same viewpoint. So I'll need to prop it up with something. So it's good to use whatever you have around you to prop things up. So I have my sketchbook. And then I also have this purple color, which I don't think I'll be using. It's a little too high. Sometimes I use my kneaded eraser if it's not super high. And I think that helped a lot. So now it's in the right, in a similar position as to what I did when I was tracing it. And make sure the petals go back down. I believe that's about the same. So now I'll go ahead and start adding in some very light marks for the simple shapes. So just define all of this a little bit more. Again, I'll have to remember that this is not the exact size, but a little bit larger than the size of the petals. If you end up drawing the flower a little bit larger than life, that's totally fine too. And if you want to draw a larger flower anyway, maybe you don't outline it first, you just draw a bigger flower. So it's all up to you. This is your sketch. And it kind of has a few lines going here. I should probably wait to add those in. And I draw these really light so that I can change them later if I want to. And I change them just with some darker marks. So I'm just starting at one spot and then I'm going to continue to work off of that. And I just think about each part related to another to determine sizing and placement. And it's not going to be exact, I just get a rough estimate of what it looks like. And you can draw any lines that might help you figure out where that shape ends and where it begins. And it is best to think of everything as simple shapes, not as a whole. Just take it little bit by little bit. To define those. Not going to be exact, just an approximate. I'm going to shade that in a little bit just to help me. A few defining marks there. And any defining shape I can see that builds off of this shape, I'm going to draw it in. And I'm using this outline I drew as a guide. Just kind of puzzling it all together. Little triangle shape, little line connecting to the other line. This is folded, but there's just little lines. Get thinner on the edges. And this I drew oh, this is the opening. And then, so to decide how big that this spot is going to be, try to look at different areas. So there's this line here, which is a bit short. So that's going to cut in a little bit more. So we can draw some darker lines to define that a bit. and it only goes probably about there. So I drew some lines to help me decide how big that's going to be. And then I can change the shape of this to make it look a little bit more curved. This has a little bit of a rough edge there again. Start adding some of those edges in there. And it might be better to wait to add those details later, but you can add them now if you'd like. There's not much to this. Here. This petal's kind of underneath the sepal here. And then this line, I feel like I need to define those a little bit. Comes down and it originates here. And then this other one comes up in a similar fashion. And from my viewpoint, kind of overlaps this back petal here. And these slightly darker lines will let me know what to follow and what not to follow. So I start with those really light marks to help guide me here. It doesn't need to be exact, so don't take too long figuring where everything belongs. I might pick this up for a second to see how that petal really falls, and it actually falls the same while it's sitting down flat, so that's easier. This line originates up here, and this actually comes a little bit more that way and then down. And I think I can darken these lines a little bit more. So it looks very much like my flower, not exact, but very close. I'm going to go ahead and continue into the green areas here. So I'll just keep drawing these elements of this plant in, remembering that this is a little bit bigger, so I already made this stem a bit too thick. I'll just change that with some slightly darker lines. So just drawing everything in and redefining everything. These darker lines if needed. Again, simple shapes, a little triangle, a little half circle here. This one has another half circle, all meeting up at a little tip like a triangle. Just adding everything in, basing each new mark on my old marks. for sizing and placement. Constantly looking back at my drawing and looking at my reference plant. And if something's not quite right, I just draw some slightly darker marks to help me decide where that actually should be placed. Now, I could go through and get rid of some of these marks, but I think it looks great on a sketch to have some of those little under sketch lines there. I think it adds more character and it's a lot of fun. I might add a few more of these lines. On the petals just for guides and sepals. And this might change just a little bit. Just if you move your head, you're going to change your view a bit. So don't worry too much about getting everything exact. It's really important just to keep going. And relax and enjoy yourself. So it's pretty easy to figure out what your plant is these days by using a simple image search from your browser or doing maybe a little search on iNaturalist. So I found out that this is an African iris or evergreen iris. So I'm going to write African iris. And then I'm going to go ahead and write the scientific name as well. Scientific name is always in italics or underlined. And I'm just doing that for consistency. But you can add in this white space any thoughts you have, observations, how you were feeling, maybe even blown up parts of the plant, maybe a dissection of parts of the plant by just cutting it in half and seeing what's inside and drawing that on the side. Maybe you want to note something you did, you could draw a little line to it and make a little note on the side about it. So about the paint or the drawing, maybe something's too big or too small, anything you're thinking of. This is your journal. Any questions you have about the plant or the weather or anything, this is all your space to add those things in. This is your sketch. Make sure to make it your own. So now go ahead and move on to adding some paint. So I have my paints left over from my step-by-step lesson, but I also have all of my paints just in case I need to mix some new colors. I think I will have to do for this demonstration. And I'm gonna go ahead and start with the yellow color, and I can just revive that yellow I already have in my palette with a little bit of water. If I need to, I can add a little bit more paint pigment to make it a little bit brighter. But I think that looks good for the initial layer of paint. Again, working light to dark. It's easier to add more color. It's very hard to take color away from a watercolor painting. So work light to dark. So I added water in my palette to create a wet light or lower concentrated color, and I'm not adding any water to my paper here. And this flower is pretty much yellow all the way through, has yellow undertones in every part of it, so it's going to be very easy to paint here. So I'm just filling the entire space in, just like I would with a crayon or a marker, just filling in that space. Picking up more color whenever it starts to run out, whenever you need it. It's getting a little lighter. Just make sure to dab it off onto your towel before applying it to your page to control the water and the paint pigment, creating a smoother coverage here. And I'm painting in just each space one at a time. And I like to go left to right to make sure I don't smudge my hands. If I started down here while I was painting in here, I might have smudged my paint, smeared it. Just helps me from making mistakes that I don't want. So large mistakes. So I cleaned off my brush. Because I'm not adding a lot of water to the paper itself, it should dry really quickly. It's already dried up here, and this part's almost dry. You want to check that by just dabbing it, not rubbing it. If you rub it, it might smear. So next, I want to add a slightly darker color to some of these areas, and I'll probably work on a different color. So I can start adding maybe these spots in, or the green area. I might just go ahead and take this green we mixed before. It is a very dark green, and that looks like the right color. So I'm going to start adding that in. Some of these areas, just being sure. It's a little dark actually. Well, that looks much better now. I'm going to add this color, and I'm just going to try to preserve some of that lighter color on the edges. To see on the plant, there's a little bit of more yellow on some parts than others. So try to preserve that a little bit. This part of the plant is dark anyway, a little darker than the rest. So I can add a darker color later, but need this lighter color for the lighter areas. It's best to work this lighter color first. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and mix an orange color because I see that it's under this brown color here. And so I'll need a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow. And if you're unsure what to do to mix colors, just refer to your color wheel. And I'm looking at this color, the red, it's kind of a reddish orange, so it might have a little more red in it. I can always add more of each color. So I'm just going to start with one drop of each and see where that takes me. The red is really bright, so staying really red, so I'm going to add a bunch more yellow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I might need even more than that. This actually looks pretty good. So 11 drops of the yellow total, and that's the 1H Hansa Yellow Light and 1 drop of the 28H Carmine. I'm going to test that out on my paper, and that looks great to me. So I'm going to go ahead and take that color and roll my tip of my brush on my towel, get that fine tip, and I'm going to go ahead and fill in these spots a bit. And my view has changed a little bit since I've moved my head. And I'm going to add some little dots. They don't have to be exact same spot, just, same basic area and amount. So just try not to add too many more, too less. But you don't have to get it exactly right. And add under there's this orange color. And pick up a little bit more paint Dab it off on my towel and continue here. Now it also looks like it's a little darker with the orange right here. Some of that color is showing through, maybe. And you can see there are a lot of spots underneath, so it looks like it is showing through a little bit. So I'm going to clean off my brush a little and then take a little bit of this paint to the side. Check it out on my paper. It's still a bit dark, so I'm going to add even more water to that spot. Test it out again. Still really dark. Maybe just clean off my brush a bunch. Probably have too much pigment in my brush. Then add more water to that spot again that I have in my palette. Test it out. Maybe a tiny bit more pigment. More pigment again. I think that looks good now. Test it just one more time. With consistency. Oh yeah, that looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in the areas where I'm seeing kind of this orange reflection. Actually, now I'm painting over the yellow and it barely shows up. So I've added just a tiny bit more. I can paint still in that same spot and then adding it in that's still wet. Just kind of adding in those areas where I'm seeing those slightly darker spots. Clean off my brush. I needed to refill my water brush barrel a little bit more water. Get new water whenever you need it. And I'm going to let this areas dry a little bit before I add more of anything in there. I'm going to go ahead and add a darker green color now. Test that out on my paper. Maybe a little darker. I think that looks good because there's some pretty dark areas. So this area right here, I'm going to add it in the darker spots. And I'm going to clean my brush because it has kind of a gradual gradient there of light to dark. And so I just took that clean damp brush and moved that edge of that paint a little bit into the other areas. Pick up a little bit more, and I think I'm going to do the same thing here. Add the paint to the dark areas, clean off my brush, and take that clean damp brush to move that paint down. And it's the same here as well. Clean off my brush and move that paint into that area. So I'm working with one spot at a time. Anytime you have too much water or too much pigment on your brush, just dab it off on your towel. Again, cleaning off my brush and then moving some of that paint into that lighter area. You can always add a little bit dark paint in the same area while it's wet too, and it'll kind of just blend in gradually into that lighter area. But I don't want that stark of a difference here, so I don't want that line to be that sharp. So I'm going to go blend it a little bit with that clean damp brush to let it kind of create a gradient. And right here, it's this dark area. Clean off my brush, that damp brush on there. Pick up a little more paint, continue on. See your area that needs to be a little darker, you can just add some more paint to it, even when it's a little wet. The edges here a little dark. Under here. Maybe a little bit more here from my perspective. And while that dries, I'm going to have to be really careful not to put my fingers in it or my hand in it while I'm painting the flower itself. But while that dries, I'm going to go ahead and add darker color to the flower. And I'm starting in the center because I want to preserve those edges there. I may have to do another layer of this because it is a very dark color. A dark brown color. Adding that in. Every once in a while I forget to dab my brush on my towel, and that's fine. I can just still go back and do that. I'm gonna clean off my brush. I'm gonna clean off pretty well because I'm gonna add the yellow. Looks good. And I'm gonna need more yellow, so I'm gonna take more of that. I'm gonna add it right here. Hopefully it doesn't get into the purple. I'm going to add a little bit of water to it. So yellow's still light even in the darker areas of the petals and the sepals. Still a little bit too dark. That looks good. So I'm going to pick some of that up, dab it off onto my towel. Make sure to use a larger space if you need it on a different part of your palette so your colors don't blend together. And this is just kind of used sparingly throughout the flower. It is a very light flower. This is pale yellow color. And it's kind of this darker yellow color in the shadowed parts. It's kind of similar to our blue-eyed grass, where it was darker and the shadow part darker purple. This is a little bit brighter than my flower. Got a little bit there, that's okay. It's a little bit brighter than my flower itself, but we can note that on the side here if you want. Again, it doesn't need to be exact, it's just a sketch. And add some little brown areas down here. Now this is dry, there's a little bit here on the tip. And so much lighter brown here on the edge there. Use the brown to make that look a little more shadowed in there. And I'm also going to use it, these petals already dry. And some of these petal parts, some of the shadowed areas, just to give it a little bit more depth. That way it doesn't look quite as flat on the page. I'm using a really light, really wet color that's wet for my palette, again, not in my paper. So that just brings a little bit more depth to that whole thing. Maybe just a little bit more here. So it went on a little too dark, so I'm just going to take a damp brush to that to lighten it up a little bit. It's imperfectly perfect. So I clean off my brush. I like where this is at. So I think a good sketch of this iris. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it where it is. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to adding some ink lines. So last I'm going to add some ink lines. It's a quick way to finish this without adding lots and lots of layers of paint. So when you're sketching, you just want to get everything done pretty quick. So it feels pretty good. It's all dry. I'm going to start with the smallest micron, the 0.05 micron. Start with the smallest because it's the most forgiving. So you can draw in some lines, give yourself some new guidelines, redefine your paint lines, your flower edges based on where your paint landed. And it's okay to draw those with this tiny ink line, just kind of like what you did with the very light sketch. I'm going to go ahead and add those in. Just redrawing and redefining the lines. Now, the lines on the petals and sepals are really light, so I'm not going to redraw those. I'm just going to draw these outer edges of the plant. Some of these lighter edges I might not draw in unless it's really apparent. This one actually is pretty dark, so I'll go ahead and draw that in. But most of these lines in here, I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Maybe I'll add a little bit here, but for the most part they blend in with those petals and the sepals. So I'm not going to draw the whole thing, just parts of it. So you can go through it and just redraw your lines. Next, I'm going to use the 0.1 micron to just add some slightly darker marks throughout. So anything that I feel needs to stand out just a little bit more, it's a little bit sharper edge. So maybe right between the petal and the sepal, maybe where the petals are in the shadow a little bit more, create some darker edges there. Like maybe where this petal goes over the sepal. Just sparingly throughout. You want the line variation because it will make it so that the image pops off the page a bit more. So don't outline the whole thing. You want some thin lines and some thicker lines. So just add it sparingly throughout here, or throughout your image. And so some of these green areas have a harder line. Actually, I think the whole thing has a pretty hard line compared to the flower itself. So I'm going to go ahead and add an outline to all of the green areas here. Not the inner parts, just the outer parts, just an outline of it. These harder, firmer edges, whereas the petals are soft. So keeping the petals, the thinner line mimics kind of that lighter, softer edges of those petals. And I shouldn't have added that line there, but it's fine. It's perfectly imperfect. It still looks good, and I like it. It's good sketch representation of this plant. And I'm going to go ahead and add in the scientific name and common name again. And I'm doing it with this pen for the same reasons. I do a light sketch just to give myself something to base it. With a really thick pen, I might make more mistakes. And if I make any mistakes with this, I can cover it up with the darker pen. So lastly, I'm going to use the 08 micron pen, black pen. It has the thickest tip, and it can smudge when you use it, so be careful not to run your hand over it before it dries. And I'm just going to add that just to a few spaces. Again, very sparingly to the flower itself. I want the flower to pop away from the stem a bit here, so I'm going to outline that area so that you can really see that this is a different space. And for consistency, I'm just going to add a little bit of a dark line there as well. Let's darken some of these lines up. And I think that that's pretty good for the flower itself. And then there are a few places, I'm going to keep with line variation, so I'm not going to outline everything. I want some thick and some thin lines, so I'm going to add just a few sparingly throughout. Some of these thicker lines in these areas but a little bit more shadowed. And then I'm going to make my common name stand out a little bit by making it a bit thicker. And there are two common African irises. They're called African iris, but since I have the scientific name, it's differentiated from the other one. And now I'm done. You can add more paint or ink to this. Just make sure it dries before you add either one. And if you want to like darken up some spaces, just don't work on it too long. It's just a sketch. Also, don't forget to use this white space to write your observations, questions, how you were feeling, anything you like. This is your sketch, your journal. So make sure to make it your own. Great job observing your world and keep practicing.